They fought without food, without water, and without hope, but they did not surrender until they died. 99 days, 3 months, and 1 week. That's all that separated the American Filipino garrison on the Bataan Peninsula from total disaster. 99 days without supplies, without reinforcements, without any real hope of rescue. 99 days against superior Japanese forces that had just conquered half of Asia and thought themselves invincible. 99 days of hunger, disease, despair. And when it was all over, the worst began. The death march that claimed thousands of lives in just a few days. This isn't a story about victory. It's a story about how people held on until their last breath, knowing help wouldn't come. It's a story about how the commander's promises were shattered by the brutal reality of war. And it's a story about the price of courage, when the only thing left to do is not give up, even when all is lost. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor is burning. Early in the morning, Japanese aircraft attacked the American base in Hawaii. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is nearly destroyed, and thousands die. America is in shock. But for the troops in the Philippines, the disaster is just beginning. A few hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers appear over Luzon, the largest island in the Philippine archipelago. December 8, 1941, the Philippines are under attack. Japanese aircraft attack the American air base at Clark Field. The Americans are unprepared. Most of their aircraft are parked on the ground, in dense rows. A perfect target. Explosions tear apart the concrete runways, and the planes burst into flames one after another. In just a few hours, the Japanese destroy more than 100 American aircraft, including 17 B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers, the pride of the U.S. Air Force. These aircraft were supposed to strike Japanese bases in Taiwan, but they never got off the ground. Now they burn on the ground. Air supremacy is lost. The Americans are left without air cover. The Japanese can bomb wherever they want, and no one can stop them. December 10, 1941. The landings begin. Japanese troops land on the northern and southern coasts of Luzon. Their objective is to capture airfields and secure beachheads for the main forces. The American command, led by General Douglas MacArthur, attempts to organize a defense, but the forces are uneven. The Americans have about 22,000 regular Army soldiers, plus about 100,000 Filipino troops, many of whom are poorly trained and armed. The Japanese have the elite 14th Army, under Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa, battle-hardened in China with modern weapons, air force, and navy. December 22-24, 1941, the main attack. The main forces of the Japanese 14th Army land at Lingayen Gulf in the north of the island and near Lamon in the south. Two powerful pincers begin to close around the capital, Manila. MacArthur realizes there are no forces to defend the entire island. The fleet is defeated, the air force is destroyed, and reinforcements will not arrive. He must retreat. December 23, 1941, order to retreat. MacArthur issued one of the most painful orders of his career, a withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula. It's a small, mountainous, jungle-covered peninsula, about 40 kilometers long and 20-30 kilometers wide, separating Manila Bay from the South China Sea. The terrain is difficult. Mountains, jungle, swamps. Japanese tanks are ineffective here. If we hold out, we can hold out. But for how long? 2 weeks? A month? Troops begin a hasty evacuation. Americans, Filipinos, support personnel, and civilians all flock to the narrow peninsula. Tens of thousands of refugees follow them. Chaos and panic reign as the columns stretch for kilometers. Japanese bombers pursue the retreating troops, dropping bombs on the roads. January 2, 1942, Manila fell. Japanese troops enter the capital of the Philippines. The city is taken practically without a fight. MacArthur declared it an open city to avoid widespread destruction. The entire island of Luzon is now under Japanese control, except for one spot, the Bataan Peninsula, and the fortress island of Corregidor, located in the middle of the entrance to Manila Bay. Here, in the jungle and fortifications, the last defenders have gathered. Approximately 80,000 soldiers, 22,000 Americans, and 58,000 Filipinos, plus approximately 26,000 civilian refugees. In total, over 100,000 people. They're preparing to hold the line. But the command knows the truth. Food supplies will last 2 or 3 weeks, if they're lucky. Ammunition is scarce. Medicine is almost non-existent. Reinforcements won't arrive. The American fleet is decimated. The nearest Allied forces are thousands of kilometers away. They're alone. And the Japanese know it. January 7, 1942. The Battle of Bataan begins. Lieutenant General Homa's Japanese 14th Army receives orders. Destroy the Bataan Garrison. Swiftly, decisively, without mercy. Tokyo demands success. The Philippines must fall so that Japanese forces can advance further south, toward Indonesia and Australia. Hama is confident his seasoned veterans will crush the resistance within 2 weeks. Tops. But the Americans and Filipinos on Bataan have no intention of surrendering. They've built a defensive line, from the east coast to the west, through mountains and jungle. The Abukay-Mauban line. Artillery, machine gun nests, and snipers are dug in here. The forces are mixed. Regular American troops, Filipino scouts, volunteers, even cooks and medics have taken up rifles. Everyone knows there's nowhere to retreat. The sea is behind them. A battle had begun that would last 99 days and become one of the bloodiest and most tragic pages in American military history. January 9, 26, 1942, First Japanese Offensive. The Japanese 14th Army launches a massive attack on the American Filipino positions. Artillery rains down fire on the defenders' trenches. Aircraft bomb command posts and warehouses. The infantry advances in waves, supported by light tanks. The Japanese are confident that the Bataan Garrison will fall in a couple of weeks, tops. Their soldiers are battle-hardened in China. They have just captured half of Asia. It will be easy to break the hungry, sick Filipinos and Americans. But the defenders refuse to surrender. On the Abukay-Mauban line, American and Filipino soldiers meet the Japanese with furious fire. Machine guns mow down the attackers in waves. Artillery strikes enemy concentrations. Snipers pick off officers. The Japanese suffer heavy losses, but continue to press. Their tactics are simple: massive attacks, wave after wave, until the defenses crack. During the first days of the attack, the Japanese attempt to break through the Allied left flank along the east coast. But the American units hold out. The Philippine scouts, elite units trained by the Americans, fight with the fury of desperation. This is their land. Their families are somewhere behind Japanese lines. There is nowhere to retreat. By mid-January, the Japanese managed to push back the defenders in several areas. The Abukay-Mauban line begins to crack. On January 22nd, the Japanese land troops behind the American Filipino forces, attempting to encircle them. The situation becomes critical. Bataan Commander General Jonathan Wainwright orders a retreat to the second line of defense, the Oriani-Bagac line. This is the last stand. There's nowhere further to go. January 26th, February 8, 1942, battles on the second line. The troops retreat into the jungle and mountains of southern Bataan. The new defensive line is shorter, about 20 kilometers from coast to coast. The positions are fortified, but supplies are running low. The Japanese continue to attack, trying to break through the defenses. Fighting rages day and night. The jungle is a nightmare. Heat, humidity, mosquitoes, snakes. There is nowhere to evacuate the wounded. The hospitals are overcrowded. The soldiers fight, collapse from exhaustion, but do not surrender. By early February, the Japanese offensive was running out of steam. General Hama realized his troops couldn't break the defenses with a swift strike. Casualties were high, several thousand killed and wounded. The soldiers were tired, and many had fallen ill with tropical diseases. Hama requested reinforcements from Tokyo. The Japanese command was furious. How could they fail to deal with a besieged, starving garrison? But the fact remained. The Americans and Filipinos were holding out. On February 8th, Hama orders a temporary halt to the offensive. The Japanese dig in, awaiting reinforcements. A lull sets in, but it's not peace. It's a respite before a new storm. February-March 1942, conditions of hell. The real enemy on Bataan isn't just the Japanese. It's hunger, disease, and despair. By February, food supplies were nearly depleted. The garrison was supposed to be supplied for 30 days, but command didn't account for the tens of thousands of refugees pouring onto the peninsula. Food is in dire need. Daily rations are cut from 2,000 calories to 2,000, then to 2,500, then to 1,000. By March, soldiers are getting 800 to 900 calories a day, a handful of rice, sometimes a little canned meat. This isn't enough even for survival, let alone combat. People weaken visibly. Muscles atrophy. Bones protrude through the skin. Mass starvation begins. The soldiers eat whatever they can find. They kill and cook horses, mules, and carabaos, Philippine water buffalo. When the animals run out, they begin eating tree bark, roots, and leaves. Some catch snakes and lizards. Others hunt monkeys in the jungle. But even this is not enough. Diseases mow down people faster than bullets. By March, almost half the garrison had fallen ill. Malaria, dysentery, scurvy, beriberi, dengue, tropical diseases raged in the overcrowded camps. Medicines were almost non-existent. Quinine for malaria had run out back in February. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, but were unable to do anything. Hospitals had become morgues. Dozens of people died daily, not from wounds, but from disease and exhaustion. Dysentery is the most common disease. Soldiers drink contaminated water from streams and swamps because there is no clean water. Their bodies are dehydrated, their immune systems collapse. People die from diarrhea within days. Malaria wipes out entire units. Soldiers lie delirious in the trenches, with temperatures approaching 40 degrees Celsius, shivering under the tropical sun. By the end of March, approximately 24,000 men were sick and unable to fight. That's almost a third of the entire garrison. The troops were wasting away not from fighting, but from hunger and disease. A psychological breakdown, but also heroism. In such conditions, it's easy to break down. Many soldiers become depressed and lose hope. They know help won't come. America is far away. The fleet is destroyed. President Roosevelt promises reinforcements, but where are they? The radio is silent. The skies over Bataan belong to the Japanese. Every day, Japanese bombers drop leaflets. Surrender. You are abandoned. No one will come. You will die in vain. But people hold on. Why? Because friends are nearby. Because there's nowhere to retreat. Because the commanders, the officers, the sergeants, lead by example. The Bataan nurses, later dubbed the Angels of Bataan, continue to work in hospitals, despite being sick and exhausted. They change bandages, hold the hands of the dying, and comfort the wounded. 77 American military nurses refused to be evacuated, remaining with the wounded until the end. The Japanese will capture them in May, and they will spend 3 years in prison camps. But they do not abandon their patients. Pilots, left without planes, take up rifles and fight like infantry. Engineers build fortifications under fire. Cooks hand out their last scraps of food while remaining hungry themselves. Filipino soldiers stay by the American side until the end, even though they could have disappeared into the jungle and returned to their families. But they don't leave. This is their country, their war. March 11th, 1942, MacArthur resigns. President Roosevelt orders General Douglas MacArthur to evacuate the Philippines. He is needed alive to lead the war in the Pacific. MacArthur doesn't want to leave. He promised to fight to the end. But orders are orders. On March 11th, under cover of darkness, MacArthur, his family, and his staff leave Corregidor Island in torpedo boats. They break through the Japanese blockade and reach Australia. Before leaving, MacArthur utters words that will become legendary. "I shall return." It's a promise. But to the soldiers on Bataan, it feels like betrayal. Their commander has abandoned them. He's safe, and they're left to die. General Jonathan Wainwright assumes command. He remains on Corregidor, while Major General Edward King takes command on Bataan. These men know they are doomed, but they will not surrender as long as they have the strength. April 3, 1942, Second Japanese Offensive. After a month of calm, the Japanese have amassed their forces and are ready for a decisive strike. General Hama has received reinforcements, fresh troops, artillery, and air power. Tokyo demands that Bataan be dealt with immediately. A handful of Americans and Filipinos has been holding down an entire army for too long. On April 3rd, a massive offensive begins. Japanese artillery rains down a barrage of fire on the defenders' positions. Aircraft bombard the defenders relentlessly. Then comes the infantry, wave after wave. The American and Filipino troops try to hold back the onslaught, but they have no more strength. The soldiers are exhausted beyond measure. Many can barely stand. Ammunition is running low. The artillery has almost fallen silent. They've run out of shells. Machine guns fire in short bursts, conserving their ammunition. The Japanese break through the defenses in several areas. The Oriani-Bagak line collapses. The defenders retreat in chaos, but there's nowhere to retreat. The sea is behind them. Units are mixed up, communication is lost, and command is unable to control the situation. By April 8th, the Japanese have cut the Bataan Garrison into several isolated groups. Organized resistance is no longer possible. April 9, 1942 dawn, surrender. Major General Edward King, commander of the forces on Bataan, understands further resistance is futile. The soldiers are too weak to hold their weapons. The wounded are dying without help. There is no ammunition, no food, no hope. Continuing would mean condemning everyone to a senseless death. Despite orders from MacArthur and Wainwright to continue fighting, King makes the decision to surrender. It's the hardest decision of his life. It's the largest surrender in the history of the American military. But he's saving lives, or so he thinks. On the morning of April 9th, General King meets with Japanese General Masaharu Homma. King tries to negotiate dignified terms of surrender, protection for the wounded, and medical care. Homma is cold and arrogant. He refuses any terms. It's an unconditional surrender. All soldiers are prisoners of war. There are no guarantees. Around 78,000 people surrender. Approximately 12,000 Americans and 66,000 Filipinos. All are exhausted, sick, and many are wounded. They think the worst is over, that now the Japanese will give them food, water, and medical treatment. They are mistaken. The worst is just beginning. April 10, 1942, the beginning of the death march. The Japanese gather the prisoners into groups and give the order. March north to the Camp O'Donnell prison camp. The distance is about 97,101 kilometers, depending on the route. The conditions are terrible. No food, no water, no medical care. Just march or die. The prisoners are lined up in columns of 4 abreast and driven along scorching roads under the blazing tropical sun. Temperatures reach 40 degrees Celsius. Humidity is almost 100%. People who haven't had proper food for months, sick with malaria and dysentery, can barely stand. Solar procedure. Every morning, Japanese guards perform a sun treatment. Prisoners are lined up in an open area and forced to stand at attention from sunrise until noon, exposed to direct sunlight. People lose consciousness from overheating and collapse. Those who collapse are shot or finished off with bayonets. This is entertainment for the guards. Then, exhausted, the prisoners are forced to march. Stops are few and brief. There is no water. The men try to drink from muddy puddles, stagnant swamps, and contaminated streams. Many die of dysentery within the first few days. Others simply collapse from exhaustion and dehydration. Cruelty without reason. Japanese guards turn the march into a sadistic entertainment. They hit prisoners with rifle butts for no reason. They shoot those who lag behind. They finish off those who fall with bayonets. Motorcyclists stick their bayonets at neck level and ride along the columns, slitting the throats of those walking close to the edge of the road. Tanks crush the fallen. Filipino civilians along the roads try to help, offering bottles of water, pieces of bread, and fruit. If the guards see this, they shoot both the prisoner and the Filipino, on the spot, without warning. The roads are littered with bodies, dead and dying, begging for help. No one can help them. One witness later recalled, "We walked, and people fell every few minutes. The Japanese would come up and shoot them in the head, or finish them off with a bayonet. Sometimes they would just leave them to die on the road. We heard screams, but we couldn't look back. If you stopped, they would kill you too. We walked along a road paved with the corpses of our comrades." The march lasts 5-6 days. The lucky ones reach the city of San Fernando in about 5 days. About 65 miles, 105 kilometers, on foot under the scorching sun, without food, without water, surrounded by death. In San Fernando, the prisoners are herded into railway cars, 100 people to a car designed for 40. The people stand tightly pressed together, unable to move, suffocating. The temperature inside is over 50 degrees Celsius. Many die of suffocation and heat stroke right there in the cars. In the town of Capes, the prisoners are disembarked and marched another 11 kilometers to Camp O'Donnell. Those who reach the camp find themselves in hell. Overcrowded barracks, no sanitation, minimal food, no medical treatment. Thousands will die in the coming weeks and months from disease and exhaustion. Losses, from 5 to 10,000 dead. The exact number of those killed on the death march is unknown. The Japanese kept no records. Some historians estimate a minimum of 5,000, 6,000. Allied reports after the war indicate that of the 72,000 prisoners taken, only 54,000 made it to the camp. This means approximately 18,000 dead, but some may have escaped into the jungle. The generally accepted casualty estimate is that 5,000, 10,000 Filipinos and 600, 650 Americans died during the march itself. But this doesn't include those who died in the camps from the consequences of the march: exhaustion, disease, and wounds. Their number is unknown, but it's believed to be high. Many of those who survived the march did not live to see the end of the war. Corregidor, the last stronghold. After the fall of Bataan, only the island fortress of Corregidor remained, where General Wainwright took refuge with the remnants of his garrison, about 13,000 men. The Japanese bombed the island day and night. On May 5th, they landed troops. After a short but fierce battle, Wainwright realized resistance was futile. On May 6, 1942, he surrendered. The Philippines were completely under Japanese control. The Battle of Bataan is over. 99 days of heroic resistance culminated in surrender and a death march. But that's not the end of the story. Camp O'Donnell, arrival at the new hell. Those who survived the death march thought the worst was over, that some kind of humane treatment, food, water, medical care, was awaiting them at the camp. But the O'Donnell prison camp in Tarlac Province turned out to be a continuation of the nightmare. The Japanese expected to take 10,000, 25,000 prisoners. They prepared 2 hospitals, minimal food, and guards. But in reality, over 72,000 prisoners were captured, 3 times the estimated number. Japanese logistics were overwhelmed and unable to cope. But the main problem wasn't logistics. It was their absolute disdain for prisoners. Conditions are worse than hell. The camp consisted of a plot of land fenced with barbed wire, containing dozens of primitive barracks made of bamboo and straw. There was no sanitation, no proper toilets, only open pits that spread infection. No clean water. People drank from contaminated springs, leading to outbreaks of dysentery. There was no medical care. The hospitals were overcrowded, and there were no medicines. The prisoners were given 1 scoop of rice a day, about 400 grams of undercooked rice, sometimes laced with worms and dirt. That's all. No meat, no vegetables, no vitamins. Already exhausted by the march and months of starvation on Bataan, the men continued to die. Death has become the norm. In the first weeks after arriving at Camp O'Donnell, up to 400 people a day died, 20 Americans and up to 380 Filipinos daily. People died from dysentery, malaria, scurvy, beriberi, and exhaustion. They died from infected wounds sustained during the march. They died from dehydration and heat stroke. They simply lay down and never rose again. By July 1942, just 3 months after the camp opened, approximately 2,500 Americans and more than 26,000 Filipinos had died at O'Donnell. This means that almost every other Filipino who entered the camp did not survive the summer. The bodies were stacked in piles. They were buried in mass graves, long trenches into which dozens of corpses were dumped at a time. Sometimes, living prisoners dug graves for their dead comrades, knowing that they, too, might be thrown in there the next day. Transfers to other camps. By the end of the summer of 1942, the Japanese began transferring prisoners from the overcrowded O'Donnell to other camps. Most of the Americans were sent to Cabanatuan, the largest POW camp in the Philippines. At its peak, it held up to 8,000 Americans, plus a small number of British, Norwegian, and Danish prisoners. Conditions in Cabanatuan were slightly better than in O'Donnell: more barracks, better organized supplies, and the ability to receive Red Cross parcels, although the Japanese often confiscated their contents. But the mortality rate remained high. Thousands of prisoners continued to die from disease and exhaustion. Slave labor. The Japanese violated the Geneva Convention, even though they hadn't signed it, and began using prisoners of war as labor. Able-bodied soldiers were sent to work, building airfields and roads, unloading ships in ports, and working in weapons factories. The conditions were brutal: 12-14 hours a day, minimal food, and beatings for the slightest infraction. Thousands of prisoners were sent on ships, the so-called hell ships, to Japan, Taiwan, Formosa, and Manchuria. Conditions on these ships were appalling. Hundreds of people were crammed into holds with no ventilation, no food, and no water in the dark. Many died en route from suffocation, dehydration, and disease. Some ships were sunk by American submarines, unaware that Allied prisoners of war were on board. Survival, the only goal. For the prisoners, every day became a struggle for survival. Some tried to earn extra money by mending clothes, making souvenirs, and bartering them for food with the guards. Others tried stealing. The risk was enormous. The Japanese killed any thief caught on the spot. Some organized clandestine trade with Filipino civilians, who smuggled food through the barbed wire. But most simply tried to survive, day after day, week after week, year after year. Many lost hope. They didn't believe they'd ever see home again. America seemed distant, unreal. The war continued. The Japanese controlled half of Asia. Who knew when it would end, or if it would end at all? But there were also those who did not give up. Some prisoners escaped and joined Filipino guerrillas fighting the Japanese in the jungle. Others secretly kept diaries, recording the names of their fallen comrades so their memory would not fade. Still others kept up the spirit of their comrades by organizing secret meetings, telling stories, and sharing their meager food. One survivor later recalled, "We survived because we couldn't afford to die next to our friends. We had to tell the world what happened here." 1944. Order to exterminate prisoners. By 1944, the war had turned against Japan. The Americans began liberating the Pacific Islands one by one. In October 1944, Douglas's General MacArthur fulfilled his promise. He returned to the Philippines, landing on Leyte Island. The Japanese High Command realized they were losing, and then Tokyo gave a monstrous order to exterminate the prisoners of war so that they would not be liberated by the Americans. The Japanese did not want witnesses to their crimes. They did not want the prisoners to tell the world what had been done to them. On December 14, 1944, at the Puerto Princesa camp on the island of Palawan, the Japanese herded 150 American prisoners into 3 bomb shelters, doused them with gasoline, and burned them alive. Those who tried to escape were machine-gunned or bayoneted. Only 11 escaped by jumping off a cliff into the sea. They survived and told the Allies about it. Upon learning of the massacre on Palawan, American command realized it was imperative to rescue the prisoners before the Japanese killed them all. Preparations for rescue operations began. October 20th, 1944. I'm back. 2.5 years have passed since General Douglas MacArthur left the Philippines, promising to return. Now he's keeping his promise. On October 20th, 1944, American troops land on the island of Leyte, in the center of the Philippine archipelago. MacArthur wades through knee-deep water onto the shore and into the radio microphone pronounces words that will go down in history. People of the Philippines, I have returned. These aren't just words. This is the beginning of liberation. But months of bloody fighting lie ahead. The Japanese have no intention of surrendering the Philippines without a fight. More than 280,000 Japanese soldiers are stationed on the islands, ready to fight to the death. The Battle of the Philippines will be one of the largest land operations of the Pacific War. January 9, 1945, landing on Luzon. American troops land at Lingayen Gulf, the very same place where the Japanese landed 3 years earlier. Now the tables are turned. The U.S. Sixth Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, is advancing south toward Manila. The Japanese are retreating, leaving a rearguard force to delay their advance. But the Americans are advancing inexorably. For the prisoners of war languishing in the camps, this is their last hope. They hear rumors. The Americans are close. Liberation could be in a matter of weeks, maybe days. But they also know of Tokyo's orders. Exterminate the prisoners before they are released. Time is running out. January 30th, 1945, raid on Cabanatuan. About 500 people, sick, emaciated, and crippled, remain in the prisoner of war camp near Cabanatuan. The Japanese have already removed the rest. These prisoners are too weak to work, so they were left behind. But now their lives are in danger. The Japanese could kill them at any moment. American command devised a daring plan to rescue the prisoners before the Japanese could exterminate them. On January 30th, 1945, a detachment of 121 Rangers from the 6th Ranger Battalion of the U.S. Army, Alamo Scouts, and approximately 250 Filipino guerrillas carried out a daring raid deep behind enemy lines. They traveled 30 miles behind enemy lines, reaching Camp Cabanatuan under cover of darkness. The plan is perfect. While an American P-61 Black Widow night fighter circles low over the camp, distracting the guards, the Rangers take up positions. At 7:45 p.m., the attack begins. The Rangers open fire with all their weapons, wiping out the Japanese guards in minutes. Filipino guerrillas block the roads, preventing reinforcements from reaching the camp. A half-hour battle liberated the camp. 522 people were rescued, 489 prisoners of war, 464 Americans, 22 British, 3 Dutch, and 33 civilians of various nationalities. Rangers suffered minimal losses, 2 killed, 4 wounded. More than 500 Japanese were killed. It was one of the most successful rescue operations in the history of the war. Freed prisoners tell horrific stories of death marches, camps, and Japanese atrocities. Their testimonies are leaked to the press, sparking outrage in America. People demand retribution. January 31, February 24, 1945, Battle of Bataan. Simultaneously with the prisoner rescue operation, American forces begin an offensive on the Bataan Peninsula, the site of the tragedy 3 years earlier. On January 31st, the operation to liberate the peninsula begins. Japanese forces are few in number, about 2,800, mostly rearguard and support units. They put up fierce resistance, but the odds are outmatched. On February 15th, the Americans launched landings on the southern and eastern parts of the peninsula. Two strike groups from the 38th and 6th Infantry Divisions advanced from the north and south, squeezing the Japanese in a pincer movement. Filipino guerrillas assisted the Americans, guiding them through the jungle and pointing out Japanese positions. On February 18th, the two groups linked up near the town of Bagak. On February 21st, 1945, the Bataan Peninsula was completely liberated after 3 years of Japanese occupation. American casualties: 338 killed, 688 wounded. Japanese casualties: about 2,400 killed, 75 wounded. Most chose death rather than capture. 25 captured. Among those liberated on Bataan are several dozen military nurses, the Angels of Bataan, who survived 3 years of captivity. Their return becomes a symbol of triumph. February 16-26, 1945, Battle of Corregidor. The island fortress of Corregidor, the last stronghold of the 1942 defense, must also be liberated. On February 16th, American paratroopers land on the island, and Marines attack from the sea. The Japanese garrison, approximately 6,000 soldiers, provides fanatical resistance. Fighting erupts for every tunnel, for every bunker. The Japanese blow up warehouses, killing themselves and those around them. On February 26th, Corregidor was declared captured. Of the 6,000 Japanese defenders, almost all were killed. Only 19 surrendered. American losses: approximately 1,000 killed and wounded. The island was reduced to ruins, but it was American again. May 1945, liberation of the remaining camps. By May 1945, most of the prisoner of war camps in the Philippines were liberated. Thousands of prisoners were rescued, emaciated, sick, crippled, but alive. They were sent for treatment and then home. Many would not live to old age. The consequences of captivity were too severe, but they survived. Some prisoners taken by the Japanese to Japan, Manchuria, and Taiwan remained in captivity until August 1945, when Japan surrendered. Soviet troops liberated the camps in Manchuria, and General Jonathan Wainwright, who commanded on Corregidor, was among those rescued. He would spend 3.5 years in captivity, one of the few high-ranking officers to survive. September 1945, retribution. On September 2, 1945, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender aboard the battleship USS Missouri. Among those present were General Douglas MacArthur, who had vowed to return 3 years earlier, and General Jonathan Wainwright, just released from captivity. It was symbolic. The war began with their defeat on Bataan and ends with their triumph. War crimes trials begin. General Masaharu Homma, commander of the Japanese 14th Army and responsible for the Bataan Death March, is arrested. In 1946, the International Military Tribunal in Manila finds him guilty of war crimes. On April 3, 1946, Homma is executed by firing squad in the Philippines, not far from where thousands of his victims perished on the death march 4 years earlier. Retribution has been meted out. Dozens of other Japanese officers and soldiers also stood trial. Some were sentenced to death, others to long prison terms. But no punishment will bring back the dead. September 2, 1945, end of the war. Representatives of all the Allied powers and defeated Japan gathered aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Pacific, presided over the ceremony. Standing next to him is General Jonathan Wainwright, just released from Japanese captivity by Soviet troops in Manchuria after 3.5 years. Two men whose fates are inextricably linked to Bataan. One left with a promise to return, the other stayed and endured the hell of captivity. Now they watch together as Japan signs the instrument of unconditional surrender. Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and Chief of the General Staff Yoshijiro Umezu sign the document. On behalf of the Allied powers, the act is signed by representatives of the United States, China, Great Britain, the USSR, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. The USSR is represented by Lieutenant General Kuzma Derevianko. World War II is officially over. For the survivors of Bataan and the Death March, this is a day of triumph and sorrow. Triumph because they lived to see victory. Sorrow because too many did not live to see this day. Price, numbers that are impossible to forget. Of the approximately 76,000 prisoners who surrendered on April 9, 1942, on Bataan, the exact number of those killed is unknown. But the statistics are horrific. 5 to 10,000 people. They died directly on the death march, shot, bayoneted, or died of exhaustion, dehydration, and heat stroke. 1,500 Americans and more than 26,000 Filipinos died at Camp O'Donnell within the first 3 months of their arrival, from disease, exhaustion, and lack of medical care. Thousands died in other camps in the Philippines, Cabanatuan, Bilibid, Davao, from slave labor, disease, and beatings. Thousands more died on the hell ships carrying prisoners to Japan, Manchuria, and Taiwan, either when the ships were sunk by American submarines unaware of their cargo or from the appalling conditions in their holds. Generally accepted assessment. Of the 76,000 prisoners captured at Bataan, approximately 40% did not survive the war. This means approximately 30,000 were killed, shot, tortured, or died of disease and exhaustion. Adding in those killed in the Battle of Bataan itself, approximately 10,000 killed and wounded, and those who died of disease during the 99-day siege, the total losses exceed 40,000. This is more than the American losses at Iwo Jima and Okinawa combined. We survived because we couldn't afford to die next to our friends. Many survivors later said that the only thing that kept them alive was a sense of duty to their fallen comrades. They had to survive to tell the world the truth, so that the names of the dead would not be forgotten, so that the crimes of the Japanese would not go unpunished. One survivor, Lester Tenney, later wrote, "Every morning I woke up and saw the dead around me. I could have given up, just lay down and died. But I thought about those who had already died. I couldn't betray their memory. I had to survive. For them." Memory, memorials, and museums. Today, there are dozens of memorials in the Philippines and the United States dedicated to the defenders of Bataan and the victims of the Death March. In the Philippines, monuments bearing the names of those killed have been erected along the route of the Death March. In the city of Balangiga, Bataan Province, stands a cross with the inscription, "In memory of the brave American and Filipino soldiers who died defending freedom." Every April in the United States, the Bataan Memorial Death March is held, a 42-kilometer marathon in the New Mexico desert, where participants carry 16-kilogram backpacks, symbolizing the suffering of prisoners. It's a memorial march, a tribute to those who completed the original Death March. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, has an exhibit on the Bataan Death March, featuring photographs, artifacts, and personal belongings of prisoners. Legacy. Lessons we must never forget. Bataan became a symbol of resilience in the face of hopelessness. The 99 days of defense demonstrated that Americans and Filipinos could fight to the last bullet, even knowing that help would not arrive. This was a lesson for Japan. Conquering territory is easy, but breaking the spirit of a people is impossible. The Bataan Death March was one of the most horrific war crimes of World War II. It demonstrated that the concept of military honor, which the Japanese Empire so prided itself on, was a lie. The Japanese military despised prisoners. According to their Bushido code, surrender was shameful, and treated them like animals. This is a crime against humanity. After the war, survivors' testimonies formed the basis for the trials of Japanese war criminals. General Masaharu Homa was sentenced to death and executed by firing squad in 1946. Dozens of other officers and soldiers were also punished, but no conviction will bring back the dead. MacArthur's return, a promise kept. When MacArthur left the Philippines in March 1942, his words, "I shall return," seemed hollow to many. How could he return if the Japanese controlled half of Asia? How could he liberate the Philippines if the American fleet was destroyed? But he returned. On October 20th, 1944, he stepped ashore on Leyte Island and declared, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The promise was kept. For Filipinos who had endured 3 years of Japanese occupation, it was a day of hope. For soldiers languishing in camps, it was a signal. Liberation was coming. MacArthur is often criticized for abandoning his troops on Bataan. Some call it treason. But he followed the president's orders and returned to lead the liberation of the Philippines. His presence at the Japanese surrender ceremony, next to General Wainwright, symbolizes a full circle. The war began with their defeat on Bataan and ended with their triumph in Tokyo. Never again. One of Bataan's memorials bears the inscription, "Never again." It's humanity's promise to itself, never again to allow such crimes to happen, never again to forget the lessons of history. But history is cyclical. Wars continue. Crimes are repeated. And that's why the memory of Bataan is so important, not as a relic of the past, but as a warning for the future. The last words of the survivors. One of the last surviving veterans of the Bataan Death March, Lester Tanay, died in 2017 at the age of 96. Before his death, he said, "I've lived a long life. I've seen the world change, but I've never forgotten those who didn't come back. Every morning I wake up and thank them for giving me life in their death. I live for them, and I want the world to remember. Wars aren't won by those who survive. Wars are won by those who don't forget." Me. Of the 76,000 who marched, many did not survive to see the end of the war, but their memory lives on. Their names are engraved on memorials. Their stories are told in books and films. Their sacrifice was not in vain. They showed the world what it means to fight for freedom, even when all hope is lost. May 3, 1946, the Tokyo trials begin. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the largest trial of Japanese war criminals, opens in the former Imperial Japanese Army War Academy in Tokyo. It is a counterpart to the Nuremberg Tribunal, which tried Nazi leaders in Germany. However, the Tokyo trial will last longer, from May 3, 1946 to November 12, 1948, nearly 2.5 years. There are 28 defendants in the dock, originally 29, but one died before the trial began, and another was declared insane. Generals, admirals, prime ministers, diplomats, the highest military and political leadership of militaristic Japan. They are accused of crimes in 3 categories. Category A, crimes against peace, planning and waging a war of aggression, violation of international law. Category B, war crimes, mass murder of prisoners of war and civilians. Category C, crimes against humanity, genocide, slavery, torture, inhumane treatment of prisoners. The prosecution is represented by 11 countries: the United States, the USSR, Great Britain, China, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, France, the Netherlands, India, and the Philippines. The lead prosecutor is U.S. Attorney Joseph Keenan. The USSR is represented by Judge Major General Ivan Zyryanov and prosecutor Sergei Golunsky, later replaced by Alexander Vasilyev. Bataan Death March to Court. One of the central accusations is the Bataan Death March and the treatment of prisoners of war. Witnesses, American and Filipino survivors, tell horrific stories. The court hears testimony about how Japanese guards shot fallen prisoners, finished them off with bayonets, and ran them over with tanks. They also hear testimony about how prisoners were forced to stand in the sun for hours, deprived of food and water, and beaten without cause. They also hear testimony about how thousands died from exhaustion, dehydration, and heat stroke within days of the march. The court was presented with documents, Japanese orders, photographs of corpses along the roads, medical reports, and the diaries of survivors. The evidence is irrefutable. These are not isolated incidents. It is a systemic policy of cruelty sanctioned by the command. Vivisection and cannibalism. The tribunal uncovers even more monstrous crimes. The chapter of the verdict, War Crimes Providing for by the Conventions, contains a section titled Vivisection and Cannibalism, which cites the following testimony. Japanese military doctors conducted live experiments on prisoners of war, vivisection without anesthesia, infection with deadly diseases, and experiments with frostbite and suffocation. By the end of the war, the Japanese Army and Navy had descended into cannibalism, eating the body parts of killed Allied prisoners of war. This practice was not unbeknownst to the command. Even officers of the rank of general and rear admiral participated. The meat of the slain prisoners was served at the table. This testimony shocks even seasoned judges. This isn't war. It's a return to barbarism. The defendants deny their guilt. All the accused completely deny their guilt or cite forgetfulness. American defense attorneys resorted to all manner of dishonest tactics, intimidating witnesses, coercing them into false testimony in favor of the defendants, falsifying facts, and presenting falsehoods. This was explained by U.S. policy to turn Japan into a bastion of the fight against communism, an ally against the USSR. The Americans did not want to show cruelty to a future vassal. At the request of the United States, Emperor Hirohito, the formal commander-in-chief of all Japanese forces during the war, was not brought to justice. The USSR and China insisted on his trial, but the Americans refused. They needed the emperor to govern occupied Japan. This became one of the most controversial decisions of the trial. November 12, 1948, sentence. After 818 open court hearings, 356 documentary evidences, and 1,194 witness statements, the tribunal delivers its verdict. 7 people were sentenced to death by hanging. Former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, Generals Kenji Doihara, Seishiro Itagaki, Heitaro Kimura, Iwana Matsui, Akira Muto, and diplomat Koki Hirota. 16 people were sentenced to life imprisonment. 2 people received prison sentences, 20 and 7 years old. The execution took place on December 23, 1948, at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. The prisoners were hanged. Their bodies were cremated, and their ashes were scattered in the ocean to ensure there were no graves left for militarists to visit. Individual trials, Hama's trial. General Masaharu Hama, who commanded the Japanese 14th Army during the conquest of the Philippines and was directly responsible for the Bataan Death March, was not tried at the Tokyo Tribunal. He was tried separately by an American military tribunal in Manila in January-February 1946. The charges: mass murder of prisoners of war, cruel treatment, and violation of the laws of war. Hama claimed he was unaware of the atrocities, that everything got out of control, and that he did not give orders to kill. But witnesses refuted this. A commander is responsible for the actions of his subordinates. That is the principle of military law. Sentence: death penalty. On April 3, 1946, General Masaharu Hama was executed by firing squad in the Philippines, not far from where thousands of his victims perished on the death march. Retribution had been meted out. Khabarovsk trial, the Soviet contribution to justice. From December 25-30, 1949, another important trial took place in Khabarovsk. The trial of 12 Japanese war criminals accused of developing and using biological weapons before the Primorsky Military District Military Tribunal. The USSR had evidence that Japan was preparing a biological war against the Soviet Union and had stockpiled enough biological weapons to wipe out the entire population of the planet. The defendants, including Kwantung Army Commander Otozo Yamada, pleaded guilty. They were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 2 to 25 years in labor camps. The Khabarovsk trial became an important complement to the Tokyo trial, demonstrating that Japan's crimes went far beyond the mere atrocities of war. Criticism and controversy. The Tokyo trial has been criticized for bias and selective justice. Emperor Hirohito, the formal commander-in-chief, avoided trial for political reasons. The owners of Japan's largest arms-producing corporations, Zaibatsu, with a vested interest in the war, were not held accountable. The USSR insisted on their trial, but the Americans refused. They were needed for Japan's reconstruction. Many low and mid-level war criminals escaped punishment or received lenient sentences. But despite its shortcomings, the Tokyo trials were an important step toward justice. They revealed to the world the scale of Japan's crimes. They gave a voice to the victims. And they established the principle that war crimes have no statute of limitations. Amnesty and political calculation. The Tokyo trials concluded in 1948, but the story of Japanese war criminals did not end there. As early as the 1950s, a process of mass amnesties and early releases began. The United States, facing the onset of the Cold War and the Korean conflict, urgently needed Japan as an ally against the spread of communism in Asia. The American government decided that pardoning war criminals would strengthen Japan as a bulwark against the USSR. 1950-1958, mass liberation. All 7 people sentenced to death at the Tokyo trials were executed on December 23, 1948. However, of the 16 sentenced to life imprisonment, not one served their full sentence. By 1958, all were released for political reasons. Some returned to active political activity. Mamoru Shigemitsu, Japan's wartime foreign minister, was sentenced to 7 years in prison. He was released early in 1950. In 1954, he again became Japan's foreign minister. The same man who represented militaristic Japan returned to the government of democratic Japan. Moreover, in 1956, he became Japan's first representative to the UN. A war criminal represented the country in an international organization created to prevent wars. Absurd? Reality. Okanori Kaya sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against peace. He was released in 1955. In 1963, he became Japan's Minister of Justice, responsible for the country's justice system. He retired from politics only in 1972, having lived a long and successful life. No remorse, no apologies. Those who escaped trial, Emperor Hirohito. The most egregious case is Emperor Hirohito, formal supreme commander of all Japanese armed forces from 1926 to 1945. All orders for war, for the expansion of aggression, for continuing resistance to the last, were signed in his name. But he was never brought to trial. Why? Politics. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the occupation forces, convinced the U.S. government that the emperor was needed to govern occupied Japan. Japanese society viewed him as a deity, a symbol of the nation. Putting him on trial would risk provoking mass resistance to the occupation, guerrilla warfare, and chaos. The USSR and China insisted on a trial for the emperor, but the Americans refused. Hirohito remained on the throne until his death in 1989 at the age of 87. He never publicly apologized for war crimes. He never acknowledged personal responsibility. For many Asian nations, this became a symbol of unfinished justice. Unit 731, A Deal with the Devil. One of the most horrific chapters of Japanese war crimes is Unit 731, a secret biological warfare unit that conducted experiments on living people, prisoners of war, civilians, including women and children. The unit's leader, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii of the Medical Service, performed vivisections without anesthesia, infecting people with plague, anthrax, and cholera to study the progression of diseases. Thousands died in agony. After the war, Ishii and his team were never prosecuted. Unit 731 wasn't even mentioned at the Tokyo trials. Why? Because the U.S. made a deal with them. Ishii handed over all the data from his experiments, thousands of pages of scientific reports obtained through torture and murder, in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The U.S. military wanted this data for its biological weapons programs. Ishii and his subordinates escaped punishment. Many of them became respected doctors, medical professors, and businessmen in Japan after the war. Some worked for American military programs. The victims of Unit 731 never received justice. Zaibatsu, industrialists of war. The owners of Japan's largest corporations, the Zaibatsu, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, and others, which produced weapons, ammunition, and military equipment, financed the war, and used millions of prisoners and civilians as slave labor, were not brought to trial. The USSR insisted on their responsibility, but the Americans refused. These companies were needed to rebuild the Japanese economy. Many of these concerns still exist, thrive, and have become global corporations. Their connection to war crimes has been forgotten. Victims of slave labor, Koreans, Chinese, and Allied prisoners of war still fight for compensation, but Japanese companies refuse to pay. Japan does not recognize convicted persons as criminals. One of the most scandalous facts: Japanese law does not recognize those convicted in post-war trials as war criminals. Japan accepted the Tokyo Tribunal's verdicts as a condition for ending the war, but these verdicts have no legal force in Japanese national law. This means that under Japanese law, Hideki Tojo, Masaharu Homa, and the other executed men are not criminals. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe publicly stated, "Japan accepted the Tokyo Tribunal as a condition of peace, but its decisions have no bearing on our national law. Those convicted are not criminals under Japanese law." This is the position of official Tokyo. The result? In Japan, there is the Yasukuni Shrine, a Shinto shrine dedicated to remembering those who fell for the motherland. Among the 2.5 million names listed at the shrine are 1,068 convicted war criminals, including 14 Category A war criminals, those tried by the Tokyo Tribunal. Japanese politicians, including prime ministers, regularly visit the shrine, sparking angry protests from China, Korea, the Philippines, and other countries that suffered Japanese aggression. Minor processes, 5,000 convicted. The Tokyo trial was the main one, but not the only one. It was followed by dozens of smaller trials in various Asian countries: Yokohama, Singapore, Manila, Rangoon, and Hong Kong. They tried Category B and C war criminals, officers and soldiers who directly committed atrocities, mass murder, rape, torture, and cruel treatment of prisoners of war. Results of small processes: 937 people were sentenced to death. Most of the executions were carried out. 358 people were sentenced to life imprisonment. More than 3,000 people received various prison terms. But that's a drop in the ocean. The Japanese army numbered millions of soldiers and officers. War crimes were committed on a massive, systematic basis. Most of the perpetrators escaped punishment, simply because there weren't enough resources, time, or political will to bring everyone to justice. Legacy: unfinished justice. The Tokyo trials were an important act of justice, but they were incomplete and controversial. The emperor escaped trial. Biological weapons developers received immunity. War industrialists remained unpunished. Thousands of low-level war criminals escaped punishment. Many convicted individuals were released early and returned to power. For the victims of Japanese aggression, Chinese, Korean, Filipino, Indonesian, and surviving prisoners of war, this remains an unhealed wound. Many still demand official apologies and compensation from Japan. But Japan refuses. The government claims all claims were settled by post-war treaties. Quote from a Bataan veteran, "We have forgiven the Japanese people. The war is over. But we cannot forgive those who tortured us, killed our comrades, and then returned to normal life as if nothing had happened. We cannot forgive the Japanese government, which refuses to recognize them as criminals. Justice demands remembrance, and remembrance demands truth."